Thank you all for having me today. As Joe said, I'm Michael Taggart, Policy Director for Energy and Commerce Republicans in the House. In that role, I lead the 5 legislative subcommittees for the committee, including the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over the NTIA and FCC, and through them, commercial and federal spectrum management. Appreciate the opportunity to give you all an update on the chair's legislative agenda for spectrum and telecommunications. Plan on giving a brief overview of what the state of play in Congress and for the committee, and to leave some time for some questions and discussions, if that works. Great. So a major focus of Chair Rodgers' leadership on the committee has been overall on ensuring the U.S. is economically competitive globally, especially in regards to countering the Chinese Communist Party in China. U.S. leadership in technological innovation is key to this and to our economic and national security. And spectrum policy plays a central role in our ability to compete in innovating new technologies and ensuring that innovation and investment is happening here in the U.S. Winning the race to 4G over a decade ago was key to ensuring that much of the economic benefits from the app economy happened in the U.S. And leading the world in developing 5G and next generation communications technologies will help ensure that advanced technologies such as autonomous vehicles, drones, virtual and augmented reality, AI, and other technologies that haven't even been thought of yet are developed in the U.S. This isn't just important for our economic success. These technologies have the potential to change the way people travel, work, and live their lives. And it's important that they are developed with U.S. values, values like respect for human rights, free speech, and free enterprise. If we let the Chinese Communist Party lead in deploying these next-gen communications and development of advanced technologies, they will use them to advance their authoritarian agenda of surveillance and control. All to say is why it's incredibly important for the U.S. to have a sound spectrum and telecommunications policies that foster innovation and competition. Which brings me to the elephant in the room, the current expiration of the FCC's spectrum auction authority. This happened, as I'm sure you all know, earlier this year for the first time ever since the FCC held its first, or began holding spectrum auctions back in the early 90s. Finding a path to reauthorizing the FCC's auction authority is a top priority for Chair Rodgers at the committee. The House has acted several times, both this year and last, on various pieces of legislation that would have extended the FCC's auction authority, among other things. Unfortunately, the Senate has failed to act on any of those. The crux of the current dispute is not over the extension of the auction authority itself, but around fixing language regarding the 3.1 to 3.4 gigahertz band of spectrum that was included in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act last year, or the IIJA. The IIJA was negotiated and drafted outside of the normal committee process, and because of that, the authorization of this, the study and potential auction of the lower 3 band departed from the usual norms for identifying and auctioning federal spectrum by putting sole authority for the study and potential auction identification of spectrum with DoD and cutting out NTIA. Bipartisan leaders of the ENC and Senate Commerce have been working for over a year to rework this language and hopefully restore the regular order process that has worked well for several decades now, restoring the NTIA's role in studying the band, which ensures that other federal agencies other than DoD that have equities in the lower 3 gigahertz band have a seat at the table, and NTIA is able to fulfill its role as overseeing federal spectrum generally. For instance, DHS and DOT also have equities in the 3.1 to 3.4 band. We've come to an agreement on language to fix the language from the IIJA that has the endorsement of the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Commerce, which took a lot of work and is no small feat. Unfortunately, the objections of a senator in the Senate has derailed the significant progress. When auction authority was set to expire March 9th, the House sent an extension to May 19th. The goal was to give us enough time to finally reach an agreement on the lower 3 language, and then do a longer-term extension of auction authority. Senator Rounds, as I'm sure you are aware, objected to the extension because he wanted to completely derail any negotiation on fixing the lower 3 language. Part of our legislative fix would have also funded the rip and replace program at FCC, which is experiencing a shortfall. This is something that we need to address by July. Otherwise, I think the FCC will have to prorate the funds that they do have. So the carriers that want to take out the Huawei and ZTE equipment in their networks will not be able to be made whole, and will have to make a decision of whether they want to participate in that program at all. So all this to say, it's very important for us to act, both to address the current expiration of the FCC's auction authority and also address the shortfall in rip and replace, along with fixing the lower 3 language. We're continuing to work with our colleagues in Senate Commerce, the Democrats on Energy and Commerce, our colleagues on the respective armed services committees, and hopefully to find a solution. We're considering passing more legislation out of the House, but at the end of the day, if there continues to be objection to passing anything by unanimous consent in the Senate, I think it's going to take the Senate to voting floor time to ensuring that auction authority and all the issues I've listed are addressed. Once we deal with the immediate expiration of the FCC's auction authority, Chair Rodgers' goal is to identify a broader spectrum pipeline and pair that with a longer-term extension of spectrum auction authority, as was done about a decade ago. So the goal is to, hopefully extend the auction authority for 18 months to 2 years, potentially longer, to give us more time to identify a pipeline. Right now there isn't a pipeline, and it's important that Congress acts to help NTIA and the FCC identify more bands to repurpose or share for commercial use. As we're seeing in the current debate over that lower 3 language, it's becoming harder and harder to identify federal spectrum for commercial use. There's not much low-hanging fruit left. So it's going to be a challenge, and we need to work with the federal incumbents and in industry and finding a path forward. There's the debate between fully vacating bans for licensed use, the unlicensed equities, but I think some balance of licensed use, sharing, non-licensed is probably the best path forward to ensuring that the federal stakeholders have the ability to have access to spectrum to fulfill their missions, while still ensuring that the commercial users are able to continue access to spectrum to continue to innovate and to grow our economy. One area that the chair is particularly excited about is the potential for low Earth orbit satellite constellations. These LEO constellations have the ability to help close the digital divide and once and for all, and can help lead to more technological innovation through ubiquitous connectivity. It's also another place where we are directly competing with the CCP and where US leadership is incredibly important. It isn't hard to see how the threat that CCP-controlled satellite constellations that span the globe could pose to the free world, especially considering what they have tried to do through our communications network through Huawei and ZTE. To help ensure that these satellites are licensed and deployed in the US and US companies are able to be competitive in this space, Chair Rodgers is leading on the first major update to the FCC's authorities related to licensing satellites in decades through the SAT Streamlining Act. This bill clarifies the FCC authorities under the Communications Act with the goal of promoting responsible use of space, incentivizing investment in the US, and advancing US leadership in next generation satellite communications networks. The SAT Act was reported unanimously out of the Energy and Commerce Committee in March, and we're hoping to bring that to the floor in the next few weeks. Speaking of authorities that haven't been updated in decades, we are also about to begin the process of reauthorizing the NTIA for the first time in several decades, since 1992 to be precise. Reducing the number of unauthorized agencies in our jurisdiction is a top priority for Chair Rodgers, and NTIA is at the top of the list. As the top advisor to the President on telecommunications policy, the agency, being the agency tasked with managing all federal spectrum, it's incredibly important that the NTIA is modernized to reflect the ever-changing telecommunications landscape. In 1992, the internet was in its infancy. The first 2G cell phone was just released, and the FCC hadn't even held its first spectrum auction yet. We plan on advancing a reauthorization of NTIA that ensures the agency is modernized to effectively manage federal spectrum holdings and increases the efficiency of federal spectrum use. Specifically, and among other things, we will look to elevate the NTIA administrator to Undersecretary of Commerce, whereas right now they're an Assistant Secretary of Commerce. This will hopefully help the administrator better manage federal stakeholders. We'll also require the NTIA and FCC to update their spectrum MOU regularly. We'll also authorize the incumbent informing capability, IIC, for NTIA to improve NTIA's ability to manage federal spectrum and enable opportunities to make more federal spectrum available for commercial use. We'll also look to codify the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee that supports NTIA's spectrum management mission with input from commercial industry. We plan on starting this reauthorization process next week when Secretary Davidson will testify before us at the committee. We welcome any thoughts that you all or others may have, suggestions on best ways to modernize the NTIA and ensure it's able to execute its mission effectively. As you can tell, spectrum policy is at the forefront of Chair Rodgers' current agenda on energy and commerce. I, again, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all and look forward to working with you and on all these important issues. And so with that, I'll open it up to any questions, and we'll do my best to answer anything, but I may have to get back to you if it's something too technical. So.
Well, this is something of a subjective question because I guess it needs you to get into the Colin Alberts. I'm a member of and director of NSMA. Given that Senator Round's opposition to the language fix is based on a letter he has from the Joint Chiefs, given that you've already gotten approval for the language from the Joint Chiefs higher up in the chain of command, namely the SecDef, can you speculate what the continuing issue is on his part then?
I mean, I can only speculate based on what he said publicly. I think the letter you're referencing was, I believe, part of the internal process that DoD ran in order to eventually have the Secretary of Defense sign that letter with the Secretary of Commerce. I believe it was from was signed by the Joint Staff, not specifically
the Chiefs, but the Joint Staff. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the concerns that we've seen Senator Rounds raise is this idea that the language would force DoD to vacate the band or parts of the band, which is just is not accurate in what the language would do. It allows the DoD to continue the study that IAJA tasked them with, and eventually report, and then based on that study, now with the language fix, with the input of NTIA and other federal stakeholders, report to Commerce and potentially identify any bans for auction. So nothing in the language would force DoD to vacate. So that seems to be a big misunderstanding about what we're trying to do here, and it seems to be.
It just seems to me that the SecDef letter seems to be kind of make it a closed question as far as the Pentagon is concerned. So
that's what we would. Argue.
Just wondering if it's precedented to continue opposition based on lower levels expressing doubts.
As far as I'm aware, it hasn't happened, at least in this space, before. But we continue to work with our colleagues in the House Armed Services Committee to make sure that they understand what we're trying to do here, and understand that Chair Rodgers would never support anything that harms our national security. She has an Air Force base right in her district, and obviously ensuring that DoD is able to fulfill its mission is top importance. And I don't think the Secretary of Defense would sign anything that did otherwise.
And one other question, caroming off of NTIA reauthorization. This is sort of a evergreen issue, meaning it probably comes up once every 5 years or so. But is your office or the committee as a whole getting any sort of suggestions as come up from time to time to either merge the FCC with the NTIA, or failing that differently, spinning off a separate spectrum management agency out of NTIA and out of the FCC to stand as its own?
Not that I'm aware of. We are just starting to circulate texts today related to reauthorization and soliciting feedback. That is not part of our current plans or discussions. We haven't seen anything back yet suggesting to do that. I think it's important to keep the FCC as an independent agency, and our focus is on making sure the current structure works, and not looking to change things too radically.
Thank you. Now, full disclosure, I do not work at NTIA. Oh yes, hi. I'm Joseph Snively. Work for Naval Information Warfare Center Atlantic. I do not work for the NTIA, but I do work with several spectrum managers. They go up that reporting chain, and we are developing some tools to help streamline and make the workflow of a spectrum manager just more automated, a little bit more intelligent. The use of collecting data from different sources, making sure things are validated before things are approved, and trying to remove as many people out of the authorization process as possible, while at the same time providing a lot of visibility to all of the stakeholders. So everyone is kind of a part of the same workflow. But we're solving problems that are, you might say, running up against a cultural momentum of, well, that's just not how we do things. We prefer PDFs and emails and things like that get lots of signatures and lots of people just conversing about the spectrum, as opposed to having tools to help automate what's going on. So is part of scaling up and making more efficient what NTIA does, is that going to be supported with tools and processes and infrastructure to make that happen? Because we could talk about collaboration all day, but if we never had Microsoft Teams and cell phones, that would be continuously difficult. So tools, I think, are a big part of that, and they have to be married to the processes as well. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a great point, and definitely something that we're interested in looking at through the reauthorization. I think anything that we can do to increase the efficiency of how federal spectrum is managed should be on the table. From the technology, the receivers that the federal agencies are used, making sure that they're up to date and able to use the spectrum more efficiently, to I think what you're raising and making sure that the overall process is supported by current and technology, and will be continue to keep up with the opportunities that technology and further efficiencies offer. So absolutely.
There was a couple other questions that came in. One was 7 to 15 gigahertz is being identified by the FCC chair as 6G. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about clearing that band from the legislative side, making that available to compete with China. Also, we earlier had a drone, we're drone presentation, and we're working quite rapidly to replace Chinese-made drones with German and U.S., mostly U.S. Just as an aside, and is there anything to help with U.S.-based manufacturing for that kind of work? And just to add on to that, also there's some Huawei rip and replace issues that we'd love to, if you want to deep dive in that a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess I'll start with the 6G. There's definitely been conversations, I think it's particularly around the 7 gigahertz band. I think the language that we had at the end of last year to hopefully fix the lower 3, fund rip and replace, and several other things, had a feasibility study related to the 7 gigahertz band. So I think it's something that we'd want to look at, understand there might be some issues with classified use in that band, and something I might be wrong, but moving some incumbents from the spectrum from AWS 3 might be relocated in there, so it could be tough. But I think we, as we're looking to a broader pipeline, as technology is able to better use, especially higher frequency bands, we want to have an open mind on what we're able to identify. I guess on the drone issue, we're not really. It's not really in the committee's purview to look at the manufacturing side or incentives or things there, but it's definitely something that we're paying close attention to, especially with DJI and our ability to compete with them and the potential national security threats posed by manufacturers, especially with connections to the CCP. Was there a question on rip and replace, or is that just?
Well, I'm David Wiley with Widelity. Just wanted to, on the rip and replace here in the U.S., we certainly hope that moves forward. We're concerned about that. But my question would be around, is there any activity thinking about international? Cyber has no boundaries.
Sure.
And so what do we do if we view it as that much of a threat here in the U.S.? How do we curtail the risks internationally with our friendlies? And is there some discussion or movement in that regard?
Sure. No, I know it's. I think both this administration and the prior administration have been talking to our allies, and I think there was some movement on that front in the last couple of years in convincing, especially our European allies, to take it more seriously. I think it is something that I think Chairman McCall and the Foreign Affairs Committee is taking a look at. I believe there's some legislation that they just marked up related to that. Might have passed the House recently. I have to go back and look. But it's definitely important, and I think it's also kind of highlights the importance of the U.S. leadership at standard-setting bodies. The ITU, it was great that we won that election. I think it was extremely important. The World Radio Conference coming up this year as well. I think U.S. leadership is extremely important. And frankly, our committee's jurisdiction is more on the domestic front, but I think the importance of addressing the Huawei and ZTE in our own networks also affects our ability to make the case globally as well. So if we're not able to do what we need to do to make sure our networks are secure, kind of weakens our ability to make that case to our allies. So I think that's another great reason why it's a top priority to address.
Good afternoon. My name is Renee Leduc. I am with Narayan Strategy, and I'm a member of all of the NSMA board as well. I have a question about really about a jurisdictional issue, specifically at House Energy and Commerce, and the fact that there are a number of different committees that are very interested in basically a number of different spectrum matters, namely the House Science Committee, who is very concerned specifically about weather and climate issues and all of the various natural hazards, as well as certainly about radio astronomy. I know that there have been some bipartisan action, specifically from really the perspective of really the House Science Committee, and now that there is Chairman Frank Lucas there, I know that he feels very strongly about some very specific weather-related spectrum matters. Given that, what is really the House Energy and Commerce Committee doing to try to collaborate and communicate productively across really committee lines to be able to deal with some of those differences? Because I would say that very clearly there have been some very different positions coming out from really Republicans inside of the House Science Committee versus really the Republicans inside of really the House Energy and Commerce. And the same thing goes for certainly the Democrats as well. And so how are you dealing with that now that basically, you are now in control, and sort of how are you best going to deal with those issues that are only going to get more sticky?
Sure. No, it's a great question. It's not isolated to our friends in on science. There's obviously the issue with the 24 gigahertz in NOAA. I think we're also dealing with friends on transportation, with FAA, obviously HASC. So there's issues across the board, and I think from Chair Rodgers' perspective, it's making sure that we have those open lines of communication with those staff, and at the member level too. I think she has a good relationship with Chairman Lucas, Chairman Graves, Chairman Rodgers, the others that really care about these issues. We do our best to be a resource to other committees when dealing with these issues. I think, again, every committee is always going to try to go to bat for the agencies in their jurisdiction. I think it's it really kind of the same issues that you have when just dealing at the agency level, and as NTIA is trying to manage that, those same issues kind of filter down to the committee level. So I think it's something that's going to be really important as we're dealing with NTIA reauthorization. I think a lot of other committees are going to have a lot of thoughts. I think especially science, given their jurisdiction over NIST, and some of the differences of opinion about what functions are better at NTIA, what are functions are better at NIST. So I think it's this reauthorization process is hopefully a good platform for us to figure out some of those differences. But at the end of the day, Chair Rodgers feels strongly that it's important to have, NTA is that one quarterback in the federal government that's in charge of these spectrum management decisions. Otherwise, every agency is going to go into their corner and protect their spectrum holdings at all costs, and never going to make any progress. So no super don't have any silver bullet there, except that it's the legislative process, and I think relationships and building a record of trust, and we're not always going to agree, but if you can at least trust what the other side is saying, working in good faith is important. So.
Another question came in. Apparently NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, has declared a quantum apocalypse, not a quantum challenge or a quantum concern. And what they're saying is that, and I guess the president issued national security memos 8 and 10 recently on the same subject, And the concern is that China, Russia, and other non-friendlies have been for years and years recording our transmissions and our undersea cables and our wireless transmissions and storing them with the hope they can break the coded communications. So this is our banking sector, it's our military sector, this is our telecom sector, writ large, and any sector that has a secret. Apparently with quantum computing, according to NIST, which I believe is under E&C jurisdiction, has stated that by 2030, all the codes are in danger of being broken, and then they recently revised it down to 2025. And then they recently revised down, apparently in the trade press, that their post-quantum technologies they're pushing are no longer quantumly unbreakable. They're now quantum resistant, which means people have figured out they can be broken.
Right.
So with all that as a backdrop, obviously that's in telecom and wireless, we're always doing FIPS. That's a standard of secure compliance, and there's other secure compliance standards. Is there any sort of push to layer on some idea of unbreakable code technology? And one answer to the test, apparently, Claude Shannon, the father of information science in World War II, studied this issue way back then. There's a mathematical theorem of unbreakable codes by Frank Butler. The US government decided to try to use it in World War II, but it was too complex. But with quantum computing, this type of, it's called OTP technology, it's unbreakable. It was too hard to deploy because it was too complex, but now it's deployable. So this sort of is like a background to, is anyone looking at this broadly to deploy this and layer it on before everything's broken and all our bank accounts are emptied and satellites are commanded by the Chinese when we don't want them to, and we don't, that kind of stuff. So that's, I know it's a broad question, but has that come to your plate yet?
Not that I've really heard so far. So to clear, so NIST is under Science-Based and Technology subcommittee or committee jurisdiction, so we don't have it. So we just have NTIA at the Department of Commerce. So no, I'd have to take a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
But it's you're painting a really rosy picture there.
Yeah. Well, we have cookies after lunch, though. They're really good cookies. Oh, another question over here.
Hi there, Andrew Farquharson from Lockheed Martin. My question was with respect to the spectrum auction specifically. I know you said once the authority was restored, something you'd be looking at doing is identifying spectrum for the broader pipeline. In that context, can you discuss whether or not identifying spectrum means by name in legislation, or is it requiring that the executive branch conduct studies to identify X megahertz of spectrum across myriad bands and aggregating it into whatever that fixed number is? And then I guess the second part of the question is identifying spectrum for the pipeline in the traditional sense of where it tends to be federal spectrum for repurpose to auction, or does that also include, such as NTI makes mention of in Pillar 1 of the National Spectrum Strategy, currently held commercial spectrum for expanded federal use in the future?
Sure. Short answer is all the above. I think we could have a combination of identifying specific bands. Obviously, a little tougher. It would require more work, especially with working with federal incumbents or commercial incumbents if we are looking to repurpose currently commercially held spectrum. But I imagine we'd have a combination of both, with requiring a certain amount of megahertz to be identified within a certain range, potentially looking at specific bands too. And yes, I think we look at both federal and commercial. I think it's important for, again, as technology progresses, to constantly be looking, to make sure that's being used as efficiently as possible, and that's in both the federal and commercial space. But all to say that we would have a lot of work to do, which is why we're looking to hopefully do a several year extension for this current one. Obviously we're fighting over one band right now. I think it's just showing how difficult it is becoming to continue to identify a pipeline. So we'll see.
There was another question on 6 gigahertz, but it relates broadly to all spectrum. In that band, there's an ongoing debate. We had a panel earlier on the subject of if harmful interference occurs into mission-critical networks, such as backhaul for state police networks, such as managing utilities, such as train control. There's a debate about how to report that back to the FCC and make sure that trains don't wreck or a 911 call doesn't go through, things like that. But writ large in that debate is the concept of there hasn't been physical tests required before new technologies go into these incumbent mission critical bands. This could apply to any mission critical band from 50 megahertz up to 60 gigahertz or above. Is there any appetite for a federal test bed, open source or open, transparent, so people could bring in their technology and it could be tested by an independent third party to really look before something gets rolled out across the country, really look hard at testing interference in real life situations, but on a micro scale instead of making the whole country a guinea pig. Does that ever come across your plate?
I think there's been conversations about that, and I think it's something we potentially look at. I know whenever you get into a debate on some of these more controversial bands, 6 gigahertz might be a good example. You have the utilities who have, their studies that they've run showing, Wi-Fi is going to cause this harmful interference. You have the unlicensed community saying, oh no, it doesn't. So I think, obviously the FCC and NTIA and ITS have a role in, trying to make those impartial. But I think we're open to ideas on how to do that better, and make sure when you're rolling out 5G that planes aren't falling out of the sky or whatever the FAA is saying.
It seems to be endemic, just looking at objective empirical data. The FAA issue with 5G, the launch of the satellite mega constellations early last year, the first 50 satellites that were launched by SpaceX. There was a minor solar flare and 30 fell out of the skies, front page news and all the major newspapers. We have the 6 gigahertz issue. There's other issues. It seems like there's not a hardcore test mode being embedded. We do have Idaho National Labs and other labs around the country, for example, for testing for interference, but we're not doing it. We're not funding it, as far as I can tell, on a real world basis, so that all the parties, if they all truly want to know the results of testing, let's presume that, let's present with the better angels of everyone's nature, then presumably as a federal policy would save a lot of money and time ultimately for everyone involved if we did these real world tests before we really rolled out deployments and had the conflicts. So.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's something we should definitely look at. I think NTIA reauthorization is a great venue to do that.
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions for Michael? Well, how about a huge round of applause? Oh, what an amazingly... yeah.